Rowan Mercer had driven this stretch of highway 1,000 times before, and never once had he seen another soul on it after dark. The road cut through miles of dry Montana grassland, flanked by distant mountains that turned purple when the sun dropped low, and the only sounds out here were the wind and the low growl of his motorcycle engine. He liked it that way. Ever since his divorce 2 years ago, Rowan had built his whole life around silence. He worked as a ranch hand during the day, fixed old bikes in his garage at night, and told himself he didn't need anything more than that. So when he saw a figure walking along the shoulder of the highway just past sunset, backpack slung over one shoulder, hair pulled into a loose knot, he almost didn't stop. People didn't walk out here. There was nothing for 20 miles in either direction, except his own ranch and a gas station that closed at 6. But something about the way she moved made him ease off the throttle. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. She was walking with the kind of forced steadiness of someone who was exhausted but refused to stop. Like her legs were moving on willpower alone. He pulled the bike onto the shoulder ahead of her and killed the engine. And in the sudden quiet, he heard her footsteps slow to a stop behind him. "You need a ride somewhere?" he asked, twisting around in his seat. She looked at him for a long moment, sizing him up the way someone does when they've learned not to trust easily. Up close, he could see she wasn't a stranger. It took him a second, but the shape of her face, the small scar above her eyebrow, the way she tilted her chin up when she was uncertain, he knew her. "Coralie?" he said. "Coralie Bennett?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time since he'd stopped, something in her shoulders loosened. "Rowan," she said, like she couldn't quite believe it. Rowan Mercer. Oh my God. They had grown up 2 houses apart, all through elementary school and into high school. Before her family moved away the summer before junior year, he hadn't seen her in almost 15 years, and here she was, standing on an empty highway in the middle of nowhere, dust on her boots, a duffel bag on her back that looked like it held everything she owned. "Is this how you pick up girls now?" she said, and there was a small, tired laugh underneath the words, but he could hear the effort it took her to make the joke. "Get on," he said. "You can tell me what happened once we're not standing in the middle of the road." She hesitated only a second before climbing on behind him, and he felt her arms wrap around his waist, lighter than he expected, like she was holding on more out of necessity than comfort. He drove slow, careful, the whole way back to his place, very aware of the fact that a woman he hadn't seen in 15 years was pressed against his back on an empty road, and neither of them said a word the entire ride. His house was small, a converted farmhouse he'd fixed up himself after the divorce, but it was warm, and it was clean, and it had food in the kitchen. He made her coffee and set out whatever he had, some leftover stew, bread, a couple of apples, and she ate like she hadn't eaten a real meal in days, though she tried to hide it, taking small bites at first before hunger won out over pride. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table. "But if you want to, I'm not going anywhere." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and stared into it for a long time before she spoke. Her husband, she told him, a man named Derek she'd married 6 years ago in Denver, had lost his job 18 months back and had been drinking more and more since. It started as arguments. Then it became something else. She'd left 3 days ago with whatever she could carry, taken a bus as far as her money would go, and when the bus broke down 2 towns over, she'd started walking. Because staying in that town, in that motel, waiting for a repair that might not come for days, felt more dangerous than moving. She didn't have a plan. Beyond putting distance between herself and the life she'd left behind. She hadn't told her parents. She hadn't told anyone. She was ashamed, she said, of how long it had taken her to leave, of the years she'd spent making excuses for him to her own reflection. Rowan didn't say much while she talked. He'd learned a long time ago that people, telling the hardest stories of their lives, don't need you to fix anything in the moment. They need you to just be there and not flinch. When she finished, her eyes were dry, but there was a rawness to her voice that told him the tears had already been spent somewhere on that highway. Before he found her, "You can stay here," he said, "as long as you need. I've got a spare room. Nobody's going to bother you." She looked at him like she was waiting for the catch, like kindness without a price tag was something she'd forgotten existed. "Why would you do that? You barely know me anymore." "I know the girl who used to sneak out of her window to catch fireflies with me when we were 11, he said. "I know the girl who cried for a week when her dog died and made me help her build a little wooden cross for him in the backyard. People don't change that much at the core, Coralie. And even if we're basically strangers now, that doesn't mean I'm going to leave you walking down a highway in the dark." She stayed. What was supposed to be a few days turned into a week, then 2. She helped around the house without being asked, mended fences with him, learned to fix a carburetor because she said she wanted to understand the machine that had, in a strange roundabout way, brought her back into his life. They talked late into the evenings, about the years they'd missed, about her time in Denver before things went bad, about his marriage that had ended quietly and without much drama. Two people who had simply stopped choosing each other one ordinary day at a time. There was an ease between them that neither of them expected, the kind of comfort that only exists between people who knew each other before the world had a chance to make them guarded. But Coralie was still married, still legally tied to a man 3 states away, and there was a fear in her that Rowan recognized, not fear of Derek finding her exactly, though that lived in her too, but fear of herself, of trusting the wrong feeling again, of mistaking gratitude for something deeper and building a new mistake on top of the last one. It was late September, almost a month after that first night on the highway, when Derek found her. He'd tracked her phone records to a gas station 2 towns over, then asked around until someone mentioned a woman matching her description riding off on the back of a motorcycle. He showed up at the ranch on a gray afternoon, his truck kicking up dust down the long drive, and Rowan watched from the porch as Coralie's whole body went rigid at the sound of the engine, like a switch flipped inside her back to the fear she'd walked 20 miles to escape. Derek wasn't drunk that day, which somehow made it worse. There was no excuse to hide behind. Just a man standing in the yard demanding his wife come home, his voice climbing with every word she refused him. Rowan stayed close but didn't step between them at first, because he understood that Coralie needed to be the one to say it, needed to hear her own voice do what her feet had already done weeks ago. And she did. She stood on that porch, hands shaking but voice steady, and told Derek that she wasn't coming back, that she'd already spoken to a lawyer through a phone call Rowan hadn't even known about, that whatever they'd had was over the night he put his hands on her for the first time, and she just hadn't had the courage yet to admit it out loud. Derek's anger cracked then, and for one terrible second it looked like he might come up those porch steps anyway. And that was the moment Rowan finally stepped forward, not with fists, just with the quiet, immovable presence of a man who wasn't going to move. Something in Derek's face gave way, not to reason, but to the simple fact that he was outmatched, outnumbered by a resolve he couldn't argue with. He left the way he came, tires spitting gravel down the long drive, and didn't come back. Coralie cried after that, finally, the tears that hadn't come on the highway arriving weeks later on that porch. And Rowan just held her while she shook, not saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Some things you just have to let a person feel all the way through. The divorce took 4 months to finalize. Coralie stayed at the ranch through the winter, and slowly, the fear in her eyes gave way to something softer, something that looked a lot like the girl he remembered chasing. Fireflies through summer grass, 20 years earlier. They didn't rush anything. There was no dramatic confession, no single moment where everything changed. It happened the way real things happen, gradually in small gestures, in the way she started leaving her boots by his door instead of the guest room, in the way he started making 2 cups of coffee every morning without thinking about it. By the time spring came, the ranch had 2 names on the mailbox instead of 1. Coralie got a job at the local school, teaching art to kids who'd never had anyone take their crayon drawing seriously before. Rowan kept fixing bikes in the evenings, and some weekends they'd ride that same highway together, the one where he'd first spotted her all those months ago. And she'd wrap her arms around his waist the same way she had that first night, except now there was nothing desperate in it, nothing born of fear. It was just 2 people who had found their way back to each other on a road that most people never even slowed down for. Years later, when people at the ranch asked how they'd met, Coralie would tell the story with a small smile. The story of a dead highway and a man on a motorcycle who stopped when nobody else would have. She never told it as a rescue story, though. She was always careful about that. She'd say Rowan didn't save her. She saved herself the day she started walking. He'd just been the one standing at the end of the road when she got there, willing to give her somewhere to land. And on quiet evenings when the light turned that same deep purple over the mountains, Rowan would sometimes think about how close he'd come to not stopping that night, how many nights before that he'd driven, right past hitchhikers and shadows on the shoulder, without a second glance. He never had a good answer for why that particular night was different, why something in him told him to slow down. He just knew that some roads only give you one chance to do the right thing, and he was grateful every single day since that he hadn't driven past it.